You probably have heard many stories, especially if you have read the books of Kings and Chronicles, about the time of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. Of course, we think of the entire nation of Israel as Israel, but during this time, you have a very difficult period in the history of God's people because the tribes are not united. Of course, you perhaps could argue throughout the time of the Judges that the tribes weren't always united even then, but ultimately God's plan for his people was that all of Jacob's descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, as we refer to them, his design was they should be one nation of his people, all serving him together as brothers through their ancestry, brothers and sisters. But that's not how things happen. You see a split between the north and the south, something we can, I guess, relate to in a sense, right? You see a division between the kingdoms of these two regions. You see a king established in the north, a king established in the south, and these two would go their separate ways for hundreds of years. Ultimately, their kingdoms would not be removed because of a reconciliation between the two. They would both be removed by captivity to a foreign power. In this time period of the history of God's people, the northern kingdoms, the majority of the tribes, sadly, tragically, we could even say, never had a single godly king. After Saul and David and Solomon, the kings over the entire 12 tribes, the northern tribes only had kings that pulled Israel further and further away from God, away from the worship of God, into idolatry. The south wasn't a whole lot better, but there were some good kings. There were some kings that did the same thing that Israel did, dragging Israel, or rather Judah in this case, into idolatry, approving of or even pushing the worship of the idols of those cultures around them. But there were some kings that did what was right. There were some kings who chose, ultimately, not only to worship God themselves, but to remove all places of worship for the idols around them. And it seems almost as if you have a back and forth situation with these kings. You'd have a good king and a bad king, and a good king and a bad king. One of the kings, the one we want to talk about this morning, fairly early on in the kingdom of Judah, was a king named Asa. I think I've only met one person in my life named Asa, but that, of course, would be a more common name at this time. He took over as king, and we're told at the very beginning, if you want the full story of Asa, the best place to go is 2 Chronicles 14 through 16. We're told at the very beginning that he was a good king who did what was right in the sight of the Lord. In fact, in both Chronicles and in Kings, we're told not only was he a good king who did right, but all the days of his life, he did not turn away from the Lord. The way it's phrased in the text is that his heart was wholly true all of his days. And we look at the account of what happens early on in his reign, and it's kind of inspiring. We see him initially take over, and he's already doing some good things. And then, as his reign is continuing, there is a group of what the text describes as Ethiopians, an army of the Ethiopians. This would be around where the country of Ethiopia is today. Unbeknownst to many, they are actually a fairly powerful force at this time in world history, even though they didn't get as much recognition as they might deserve for that achievement, we could say. And so this army of, the text says, if we understand the numbering system right, about 1 million soldiers come to attack the southern kingdom. Of course, Ethiopia is south of Israel, so naturally they're going to attack Judah first. Asa does not have nearly that many. He only has 2,000-3,000 soldiers, something around that. He doesn't have good odds in this battle. Any military strategist can tell you outnumbered over 3-1 is not good odds. But what do we see Asa do? We don't just see him bravely go into battle. That would be a statement to his character, I suppose. We see him approach God and ask God for victory, in faith that God can provide the victory. And God does. And they send the army of Ethiopia away from their land and protect their land from the invaders. Later on, you see another army come, and again, they are able to defeat them. Asa at this point is demonstrating a lot of faith. But it's about to get better. Because then a prophet comes to Asa. Of course, this was the time where prophets were particularly active in the kingdoms themselves. This is the time that you have people like Elisha and Elijah in the northern kingdom. Well, here you have other prophets as well in the southern kingdom. One of them comes to Asa, and he tells him a message from God, essentially saying, you have proven yourself faithful. If you continue to do this, if you continue to follow my commandments, I will bless you. I will support you. I will protect you. And Asa takes this to heart. He goes on a mission to rid the nation of any idolatrous practices that he can find, trying to bring them back to the one true God. Everything seems to be going well. But then something happens. Something that already happened, ironically enough. There is a foreign invader. This time, it is not foreign at least as much as the others, because it's actually the northern kingdom of Israel. Baasha is the king at this time, or Baasha, I guess, if you want to pronounce it more scholarly. I prefer to pronounce it like it sounds to me, but whatever. And Baasha is going to try and invade the southern kingdom along with Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. You would think, given his previous track record, Asa is going to respond to this by calling on God, asking for the victory. That's not what we see happens this time, however. Asa takes all the gold he can find in his household, all the king's treasure. Then he goes to the temple. And he takes all the gold from there as well. And he presents all this gold to the ally of Baasha, the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, and says, I'll give you this if you will switch sides and help me out against the king of Israel who is trying to invade. And it does work out. And he switches alliances, and Baasha is not successful in invading. And Asa again gets a visit from a prophet. But this time, it's not good news. Because I think we all know what the prophet's going to say. He says, on behalf of God, what happened? You knew I could give you victory. This same scenario has happened before. And yet, instead of relying on me, you relied on a pagan king of some other kingdom in order to save your throne and your people. Asa doesn't like that. In fact, Asa persecutes this prophet for his message. But Asa is told by the prophet, you are going to have wars in your kingdom for the rest of your reign because of what you've done. And that's exactly what happens. Asa later is going to get a disease. And even in that dire predicament, this isn't just his nation being attacked, this is him personally. He still relies on the physicians of his day and doesn't even ask God for help. What happened? all this, we're told Asa was wholly true to God all of his days, and yet we clearly see something changed. He abandoned what he had originally fought for, what he originally held to. It's honestly, as you might see from the title of the lesson, a tragedy. I would argue it's written as a tragedy. This shouldn't have happened. He started out so well. It should kind of remind us of King Saul. He also started out well, but didn't end well. Doesn't mean Asa ever abandoned God. In fact, we're told he didn't. But he didn't do what God expected of him towards the end. Just for a few minutes this morning, I want us to consider some lessons we can learn from what we should recognize as a tragedy. Scripture says that these things were written for our learning. Let's see what we can learn. First thing that I want us to think about, something that's kind of a flip on what we usually say. Don't quit while you're ahead. Sometimes we use the opposite of that, right? We need to quit while we're ahead. We're doing well at something. Oh, if we go too far down this path, we might mess up what we're doing. Let's just quit while we're ahead. I'm not saying that in most contexts that's a bad thing or something like that, but I want us to think about what that means in Asa's case. He did so well at first. He proved that God could deliver through his own experience. Not that God needed the proof, but Asa experienced the victory of God against all odds. Why didn't he keep it up? Although we're not exactly told all of the things that went into that, I would argue the reason he didn't keep it up is because he stopped appreciating it. He valued those victories. He valued the proceeds of his faith, if you will, for a while. But eventually, his mind turned to other things and he forgot. If you have ever talked with someone who has struggled with addiction, whatever the addiction might be, addiction to substances, alcohol, relations, and whatever else we might throw in that category. If you ever talk to someone who falls in that category, I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but someone who has struggled with that in a very real sense, you're going to, if they're willing to talk about their experience, which most are, they're going to tell you something that is very insightful. And that is that the process of overcoming something like addiction is a day-by-day thing. And the reason for that is you can have a great day as an addict. You can resist the temptation to fall back into whatever it might be. But that one day is just one day. If you let your guard down the next day because you had such a good day the previous day, before you know it, you'll be even deeper than you were before. It's so easy for us, both physically and spiritually, to let our guard down after we have a victory. And I would argue that's exactly what Asa did. He not only had one victory, he had two victories. And then he forgot who gave them to him. He forgot how they were accomplished. In Matthew chapter 4 and verse 11, we have the end of Jesus' temptation by Satan. He's gone out to the wilderness, been there 40 days and 40 nights without food. The devil comes and he tempts him in all these ways that, let's be honest, probably we would have fallen for all three, right? He tempts him in all these ways. Jesus rejects the temptation. He resists. He does not fall for the devil's lies. And so we're told the devil leaves him. What a victory. Can you imagine if Jesus got cocky? Can you imagine if he got so focused on what he had just accomplished that he let his guard down? Satan didn't stop tempting Jesus after that. He just took a break. Imagine if Jesus had also taken a break. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12, Paul warns us very poignantly. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. That's not to say we shouldn't rejoice in our victories, in our battles with temptation that we win. We should rejoice. We should be encouraged. We should be encouraged to keep up the fight. Not to become lax. Because that's exactly when Satan can get us. Satan might lose that battle, but he knows his counterattack might be even better. And we have to be aware of that too. We're told in 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 that he walks about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. The lions don't usually, to my knowledge, kill for sport. They kill for food. If they're hungry, they might not eat right then. But they'll be hungry again. Not to say Satan has an appetite in the same sense for the destruction of humankind, although in a sense he does. But just because he's left, or just because he's been defeated, we cannot allow ourselves to forget that he may come back. And we cannot allow ourselves to forget how we can defeat him. It's far too easy to let our guard down after a major spiritual victory. Satan's an expert at his job, to put it in human terms. He knows where our weak points are. And while we're focused on our strength in this area, he's finding the back door to make inroads, create a beachhead, if you will, so that he can push in and conquer our hearts. It's far too easy to let our guard down after a major spiritual victory. But I want us to notice something else from this tragedy of Asa's later years as well. And that is that when we are needing help, as Asa was, we should never go to others for God's help. I don't mean don't go to others so they can pray to God on our behalf. That's not what I'm talking about. There are things that God has said, I will do this. I am the one who you should come to for this. And sometimes we're more comfortable going to a human being who's more accessible, who's more tangible, and relying on them instead of God. I think about whether in movies or sometimes in very real situations, in a marriage context. It is a wonderful and healthy thing for both spouses to have friends and to have relationships outside of the two of them. It's not healthy for them to just be off to themselves all the time and not have any other relationships. I have a best friend. Y'all have met him, Connor, right? I love hanging out with him. It helps me to hang out with him. Helps Liz when she's kind of tired of being around me, right? Liz has a best friend that she hangs out with. Whenever I need to be off doing my thing and she can be on the phone with her, that's a wonderful thing. But so many times, in so many relationships, whenever there's friction, whenever there's conflict, one spouse, or maybe even both, begin going to others for what their spouse alone is designed to offer. I'm not even talking about affairs and things of that nature, although certainly that's part of it. Oftentimes, we end up going to someone else to provide perhaps the emotional closeness or support or encouragement that, while that does need to be part of our relationships with others, our primary confidant, our primary companion, our primary encourager to be our spouse. But we end up going to someone else. And they become bigger in our minds, more vital in our minds in that role, and it pushes us away from our spouse. That's ultimately what Asa did when he went to the king of Syria instead of going to God. There's a reason why throughout most of Israel and Judah's history, God consistently through the prophets describes their attitude as spiritual adultery. Because they're going outside of their covenant relationship with God and relying instead on someone else for what God alone has said He will provide. God fights Israel's battles, at least He's supposed to, unless Israel refuses to let it. Unless they begin relying on others. And this happens throughout Israel's history on multiple levels. Think about King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 28 verse 7. God and God's priests alone are to be responsible, rather God's priests specifically, are to be responsible for the sacrifices that are to be made to God alone. But a priest isn't available for Saul in this instance. Or a prophet, rather, is not available for Saul in this instance. I'm getting two of Saul's mistakes mixed up. And so instead of accepting what his situation is and that God is not answering him for a reason, Saul seeks out a medium. What essentially would be a necromancer, I guess, in maybe more modern terms. I don't know which one is more common today. Someone who calls up the dead. A pagan, certainly. Someone who does not believe in God, someone who is not following God. He goes to them for help because he's not getting what he wants from God. In Isaiah chapter 36, Israel is doing something very similar to what Asa does here. They are depending on alliances with the nations. In this case, they're depending on Egypt to protect them, to provide the military strength they need. And Isaiah, on God's behalf, describes this as if they're leaning on a reed like a cane that's about to splinter and stab them in the hand. I hope none of you have had an experience like that with a cane or a crutch or something. I can't imagine how painful that would be. But the point is, you're going to them instead of to me. And that's not going to help anyone. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 12, we see this applied in an even more spiritual sense, I guess you could say, under the new covenant, when Peter makes it very clear that there is salvation in no other. We can't go to anyone else, anything else in this life for salvation. At least not salvation from what truly matters. Nothing else can provide salvation from sin and from death. There is one name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. And yet, friends, we look around in the world today. How many places are people going for salvation, for help, for hope? Everywhere but Christ. Don't go to others for God's help, for the help that only God can provide. If I turn to others for what God alone can provide, neither one will help me. God won't help me. I'm not asking Him for His help. He would if I asked. The people I'm going to for help instead, they can't help me, not in the way that I need. I go to others for what only God can provide. Neither one will help. But thirdly, I want us to learn one more lesson from Asa. If you look at what he did, he doesn't put up idols again. Many of his predecessors and those who would come after him did that. He never abandoned the worship of Yahweh. He never brought idolatry back into Judah in his later years. In fact, the text says, both in Kings and 2 Chronicles, that he was wholly true all his days. Clearly in the text, that doesn't mean he was wholly obedient. I would argue it means he was always loyal. in the sense that he never abandoned God for the worship of others. But I can be both loyal and disobedient. And I think we forget that sometimes. That doesn't seem possible, right? How could I be both loyal and disobedient? If you enjoy studying history, especially military history, I know I'm a nerd, but y'all know I like that kind of stuff. I enjoy reading a history of battles and campaigns and things like that. It's fascinating how many times you have a soldier or an officer in the army who is given direct orders, doesn't obey those orders. Sometimes it causes a disaster. Sometimes it actually causes a victory. But in either case, I think we can all agree the soldier disobeyed orders, right? He was disobedient. Does that mean he was disloyal? He didn't switch sides. He didn't turn on his country or his army that he's a part of or whatever. He's not disloyal in that sense. But he's not obeying either. By the way, I would argue most of the time historically, when that happens, it doesn't end well. Precisely because there's a reason why you have a hierarchy. You have a set chain of command. That's what Asa does here. He doesn't turn on God. He doesn't abandon God. He doesn't stop worshiping God or tell Israel to stop. But he doesn't obey God either. And he is punished for that. Because it's not enough just to be loyal in that sense. In Numbers chapter 20 and verse 10, we see a very similar incident happen with Moses. Moses never in his entire life abandoned God. Even Aaron at one point built the golden calf, right? Moses never did anything like that. But when God told Moses to speak to the rock, Moses decided to take matters into his own hands. Striking the rock, taking the credit in a sense on himself, and he did not enter the promised land because of it. He wasn't disloyal, but he was disobedient, and he was punished. In 2 Samuel 6, verses 1 through 8, David wants to move the Ark of the Covenant back where it belongs after it was taken captive by the Philistines. Admirable goal. There's a way you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to have the priests put the poles through the rings of the ark and carry it. Instead, they put it on a cart, carried by oxen. And most of us probably know what happened after that. One of the young men who is standing there beside the cart sees the ark potentially about to tip over. I don't believe there was any intent to disobey or any ill will in the young man's heart. Probably reflex more than anything. He reaches out to stop it from falling, and he's struck dead because no one can touch the holy ark of the covenant where God's glory and presence is displayed. David wasn't disloyal. He was trying to do something that was honorable overall, that was service to God. But he didn't obey the way God had said to do it. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, Jesus is addressing the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Remember what he says? He tells the people, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. I believe Kevin alluded to this on Wednesday. The Pharisees had purged idolatry from their midst. And that's to their credit. They were loyal. They were not going to have any other gods before Yahweh. But they weren't obeying either. And we today, we may never renounce the name Christian. We may never abandon God. That doesn't mean we're being obedient. That's not the ticket in, just to be loyal in that sense. I may never abandon God, but I can still oppose His will. Scripture is full of examples of just that. Brethren, this story is not here as a discouragement. This story is not here as a tragedy for tragedy's sake. It is here for us to learn. It is here for us not to make the same mistakes. It is here for us not to turn our lives into a similar tragedy. Because it's far too easy for us to do all these same things. Not in the same context. None of us is the king of America or something. But all of us can and probably at some point have become a little too confident and let our guard down. All of us can and probably at some point have set our focus and our dependence on someone else instead of recognizing that our faith and our trust needs to be in God. Not that others can't help us, not that we don't go to others for assistance and help, but our faith is not in any one person, any nation, any government. Our faith should be in God. And it's so easy for us to claim the name of Christ, to claim to be following Him, to be loyal, and not to be obedient. Let's learn from Asa. We have the chance to change history, if you will. It doesn't have to repeat. We don't have to make those same mistakes. If we do, we can make them right. Asa remained kind of bitter, it seems, for the rest of his life, even though he didn't abandon God. Our story is quite different. And if we can help you make a difference in these things that you're struggling with this morning, whatever they may be, we are always ready to help in whatever we can do. Please let us know as we stand and as we sing together. All things are ready. Come to